Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Shreya Adaraju, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at Georgetown and a Global Social Enterprise Initiative student leader. A student leader, just to give you a background, contributes to, involves in, and in some instances brings into the classroom GSCI's multitude of important and engaging projects, all of which not only provide insight, but often set the tone for us specifically with regards to thought leadership and insight into the real-life challenges faced in social enterprise. Today's panel is the second in a series of discussions titled C-Value Conversations. These conversations are specifically designed to expose students and professionals alike to how social, economic, and environmental value can facilitate lasting and valuable change. Our panelists today will discuss seeing value in crisis. For me and my fellow MBA students, this issue is always on the forefront and is often discussed. Namely, the true test of a leader is a direct output of how they deal with and move on from a crisis. While we have many opportunities to learn and study crisis in the classroom, it's these types of interactive experiences and instances, hearing from professionals that have dealt with and overcome crisis, that will really help shape our foundation as future leaders. So on that note, I'm very excited to introduce our moderator for the panel, Professor Bill Novelli, the founder of the Global Social Enterprise Initiative, as well as our panelists today. Professor, please take the floor. Thank you.
Shreya, let's applaud. Shreya, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University and the Global Social Enterprise Initiative. I'd like to introduce my colleague and the executive director of GSCI, LaDawn Manteigue, sitting in the front there. Raise your hand, please, LaDawn. Hello. Now, the C value, the SEE stands for social, environmental, social, economic, and environmental value. So that's what we're really talking about here, all those different parts of, if you will, the triple bottom line. And the subject, as you know, you just heard, is the whole issue of seeing value in crisis. Now, Rahm Emanuel, who's now the mayor of Chicago and who was once in the White House, famously said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Well, if you're in a crisis, you may not agree. He was talking about the opportunity of crisis, and a little while ago with our student leaders, we were discussing this with our panelists, and opportunity is a many-splendored word. Now today, we live in a world that the panelists pointed out is very, very different. So people today are much more informed. It's just that they're not better informed. And so what we're going to be talking about today in terms of a crisis is how to gain value out of a crisis. How an organization moves forward from a crisis with renewed trust. And how you basically can survive the crisis that you find yourself in. We have a really excellent panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. The first panelist is Eric Desenhall. He's the CEO of Desenhall Resources, which is a leading crisis management firm. Eric's focus is media relations, litigation, trial communication, crises and management defense in a variety of industries. The Washington Post wrote about Eric, businesses under attack want Eric Desenhall on their side. He was named one of Business Insider's 25 most influential PR people behind the scenes of corporate America. I'm surprised he accepted that because he does not think of himself as a PR person. He's a prolific author whose latest book is Glass Jaw, a manifesto for defending fragile reputations in an age of instant scandal. Liz Sidoti is the head of U.S. communications for BP. She joined the company early in 2014, and she's on the leadership team of BP America's Communications and External Affairs Group. Liz oversees BP Media Affairs, Advertising, Internal Communications, Social and Digital Media, and Executive Speechwriting. Previously, she was the national politics editor for the Associated Press, where she coordinated AP's coverage of the 2012 U.S. presidential campaign, as well as political trends and breaking news across federal government agencies, Congress, and the White House. She's also a veteran of state political reporting, having covered the Ohio State House, and she's been a local reporter as well. Chiquita Brooks-LaSure is a consultant and advisor in the healthcare industry. From 2010 to 2014, she was in the Obama administration, most recently as policy director at the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, which oversees the private health insurance provisions of the Affordable Care Act and works with states on the health insurance exchanges. She's also served in other healthcare oversight roles at HHS, and she testified on behalf of the administration before Congress, as well as in press briefings and other venues. Previously, Chiquita was at Avalier Health, and before that at the White House Office of Management and Budget. And I must add, she is a Hoya, with her master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. So here's how we're going to work this. Each of our panelists is going to speak for approximately 5 minutes, and then we're going to have a brief discussion among ourselves, and then open it up to you. So we'll start with Eric.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I guess you certainly can't hear me. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on a new book I wrote called Glassjaw. Glassjaw is a boxing term. It's a term that generally refers to a big, scary-looking fighter who cannot take a punch. And that really is the analogy for what a lot of corporations and public figures are facing in this new environment. The inability for the conventionally powerful to take a hit. We see this all the time. We see what's happened with Toyota and Volkswagen. BP certainly faced it a few years ago with the oil spill. I'm going to move this down because I'm hearing. Can you all hear me all right? Thank you. The Susan Komen Foundation, once at the top of their game, faced it. Certainly, as Chiquita will talk about, the debut of the healthcare.gov website faced what I call in my book the fiasco vortex. And what the fiasco vortex is a runaway crisis. It's a black hole where no matter what you do, it doesn't work in the short term. And the reason why powerful organizations are facing this fiasco vortex, where everything you do to manage a crisis seems to be ineffective or backfire, is really 3 variables. Velocity, volume, and venom. The velocity, the speed with which news now moves. Volume, the number of news outlets and people weighing in. Online, mainstream media, not so mainstream media. And then there's venom, the fact that negativity moves the internet. And these variables simply did not exist when I started in business some 3 decades ago. You had certain runaway crises, but you did not have this vortex effect that is caused by this combination of velocity, volume, and venom. I think that one of my issues with what the crisis management industry has become is it's been an industry that is governed by platitudes. Things like change the conversation, get ahead of the story, a crisis is an opportunity, borrow against your trust bank. These are things that sound wonderful, but are simply not true in terms of managing a crisis in the short term. So much of what my industry seeks to sell is the illusion of control. You now have TV shows like Scandal, where you have this fetishization of the spin doctor. Movies like Michael Clayton, Wag the Dog, you now have Our Brand is Crisis. And what has happened is, 30 years ago when I told people what I did for a living, they would be, what? Now they say, oh yeah, my brother-in-law is a crisis management firm. And there is this notion that we are magicians who are able to perform Jedi mind tricks. And the reality is it's getting harder and harder for the most sophisticated organizations to be able to survive a crisis in the short term. I remember being on TV debating someone during the BP crisis with which I was not involved, and this pundit, a PR person, I think, said something like, BP really isn't using social media correctly. That's the problem. And I thought, really? You think the problem here is a failure of communications? The ocean blew up. And the solution to this, there will be a direct and immediate correlation between when the leak at the bottom of the ocean is plugged and when this recedes from the news. The solution is not a PR solution. It's plug the leak, clean the mess, compensate the community. Similarly, when healthcare.gov debuted, I had a few invitations to speak about this, and the questions were always loaded. Boy, do you think that they're mismanaging this? And they thought that they would, because they were getting somebody who had worked in the Reagan White House, that I would slam an Obama administration initiative. And I said to this one reporter, I said, do you have children? Yes. I said, how old was your child when he started to walk? And the reporter said, 18 months. I said, why not right away? And they said, well, babies don't walk right away. I said, exactly. Why would you think something so like healthcare.gov would work right away? But there is this notion that everything is supposed to happen magically. The good news in all of this bad news I'm giving you about crisis management is most crises are survivable. They are simply not survivable in the immediate term. When someone says to me, can Toyota survive? Can J&J survive the recalls? The answer is most of these companies survive very well. They just don't survive in the immediate vortex. And one of the things that you'll find is that the solution to a lot of these crises has very little to do with PR and everything to do with operational considerations. Things are resolved behind the scenes where nobody can see them. And the final point that I would make before moving along with my colleagues is too much is made over what is the strategy, what is the crisis management strategy. The fact is, a strategy is one of those words that people use because it sounds very smart. What I find is what resolves the thing that gets crises through is leadership. If given the choice between a good, strong leader and a good strategy, I always choose the leader.
Thank you, Eric. Liz?
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for putting this panel together. It's really fun to kind of take a break from managing crisis on a daily basis, to step back a bit and talk a little bit about how do we do this. I will start by saying, BP continues to be in litigation, stemming from Deepwater Horizon spill. I'm going to be limited in what I can say, but that's actually okay because a lot of my philosophy for how do you manage crisis comes from my time as a reporter and a journalist and an editor, not within the past 2 years. I think that I didn't fully appreciate the skill set that in being an observer of crisis, a chronicler of crisis, someone who actually judged whether or not the healthcare rollout was flawed or not, gave me the skill set to be able in the last 2 years. Can you guys hear me okay? Gave me the skill set in the last 2 years to be able to then become a practitioner of crisis management. So there's a couple things that I drew from my 15 years in journalism that I now apply in my daily work. I always kind of start, how big the crisis is doesn't matter. It always there's a formula that I use that sort of helps keep it all in perspective. And it starts with, what's the worst case scenario? Okay, how bad could this really end up? And then defining what the objective is really important. Having a scope on, okay, what do we think what are we trying to achieve here? I then sort of move to, who's the audience? An example I use is the audience may not be the general public. We may not be working to convince the general public that we were in the right and not the wrong. We may be trying to convince a certain lawmaker. So who's the audience? How do we tailor our response? Should we decide to respond to a specific audience? Then what's the argument? What's the argument we're trying to make here? And I struggle with this piece. We talked a little bit about it a few minutes ago. I have long, as a journalist, been a believer in the fact-based argument. And I believe that corporations do have good stories to tell. And institutions do have good stories to tell. And you can't fight over facts. Facts are facts. And then I put my reporter hat on, and I say, but I know reporters, and if I were a reporter, it didn't matter what a corporation said. It came from a corporation. Even if it was facts, it was their facts. They were their facts. They weren't, in unbiased institutes of facts. So I struggle with what is our argument, and how much of that argument should be fact-based, and how much of that argument should be aspirational. And the reason I say that is, as a journalist, I remember covering Barack Obama in 2008, and his slogan was "Change you can believe in." Right? Where's the fact in that? So I struggle with this. The reason why he was so successful, yes, he had a platform of facts, platform of positions with a ton of facts, but change you can believe in is an aspirational selling point where the facts were whatever each individual wanted to ascribe to that aspirational notion. And he was very successful in selling that idea to the American public. So what's the argument? And how much of that argument should be fact-based and how much of that argument should not be? Then you move to what's the appropriate response and strategy? And then you go to the tactics. I find that oftentimes some of the most flawed crisis response, and there is no perfect crisis response, so let's set that notion aside. Some of the most flawed crisis response is because folks move to tactics before they go through a list of what do we know, what don't we know, what's the desired outcome, who is the audience. And then this isn't a one-time process that we use. There's a couple of tenets that I use that go along with it, which is be flexible, because in this era of constant information, new information is added to that framework every moment, and you have to adapt and adjust. And you may have to run through this list 50 times before you come to the ultimate answer about what you should do. And then as soon as you execute that response strategy, you then may have to change it because new information is always coming in. So throughout it, being flexible is very important. And then the last point I'll make, and as it relates to crisis response, is keeping perspective. I may be stealing part of you, but keeping perspective. This isn't life or death, it's just business. Our business tends to be life and death, as we've proven. It is the oil and gas industry is a challenging industry. And so keeping in the back of your mind, the crisis issues that we deal with on a daily basis aren't life and death crisis issues. It allows you to take the long view on going through this, not overreacting, but having a systematic understanding of how do you approach a current situation while keeping it all in perspective.
Liz, thank you. Chiquita.
Let me join Liz in also thanking you all for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and also a pleasure really to reflect. It's incredible just to look back upon that time, and I'm going to start by taking us back just a couple of years and giving you a little bit of a sense of what it was like. As you know, the Affordable Care Act passed into law, became law in 2010, and I was on the Hill at the Ways and Means Committee through that process, and as you all know, it was a very bruising process, highly political, and so we emerged from that time in the administration under immense scrutiny. There were certainly, Congress was looking very closely to see how the administration would implement the law. You had stakeholders who had an incredible amount of investment, whether from a business perspective or from a how will I be affected perspective. And then you had consumers and individuals who had pent-up demand of wanting affordable health insurance. And so we emerged into the end of 2013 with high expectations, high scrutiny, and it had been a difficult couple of years of just constant attention. So we start in October with the government shutting down. And part of that shutdown was actually over the Affordable Care Act and a desire to not see the law fully implemented. And again, high expectations. The website hasn't worked. And, it took a few days for that to be really evident because the shutdown was really top of the mind at the forefront. But within a few days, it was clear that people were not being able to do what they wanted to do, which was log into the website, give some information, choose some insurance coverage, and then determine whether they were financially eligible for assistance. And so it very quickly, full-blown crisis of very public, in a very public way. And I think we're human, right? And what happens when you're in the midst of a crisis? There is a rush to blame and to say, it's not my fault, I did X and Z right. I don't know why this isn't working, but this isn't my problem in terms of my responsibility. There's a rush to fix the problem, and as Liz and Eric were talking about, it's really key to figure out what's going to be your priority, because there is a mad desire to get out in our world of very fast media to explain, but the key is actually fixing the actual problem, because that's the only way you're going to emerge from the crisis. You can have the best explanation in the world, but at the end of the day, the measure was going to be, and is, can people actually enroll in coverage? Can the website do what it was designed to do? And so you have just a great deal of noise. You also have competing priorities. The website, we call it a website, but it was much more and is much more complex than that. It does many things. And different people had different priorities about what would be the most important thing to accomplish, whether it's getting people enrolled in something, getting the easy cases through, getting people able to just shop and determine their plans, because there were going to be a few more months before people were actually going to get coverage. And so in a crisis, again, they're just competing issues. And what I learned through that process, what we ultimately did, was really have one person who's responsible for just that. We had many senior people who had other responsibilities. CMS and HHS have many programs they're operating. Obviously, healthcare.gov was the big one, but it was only one of many things that the government does that people were depending on. And so really needing one person, one entity, what we, in our instance, was a systems integrator, to really look at the big picture and to say, all right, we're going to figure out from soup to nuts, what do we need to do to get this operational? And then bringing everyone to the table who had a piece and a part of the responsibility in one room, and coming to agreement about what the path forward was going to be. So here are going to be our list of priorities each day, and each day we are going to evaluate whether we've met those and move on to the next day. So, and it can be challenging in that kind of environment. As I said, people have competing ideas about what's the priority, but you need to have a decision maker who says, okay, this is going to be the set of tasks that we have to do, and we will eventually emerge on the other side of this, but we're going to have to methodically go through this process. And that can be incredibly difficult when ultimately you know that's going to take some time, because in the short term there just is this desire to fix things right away. But when you have a list of 1,000 things that must be done, it can be daunting. But we took it step by step. Okay, today these 5 things are going to occur, and then at the end of the day, do the 5 things get done? No. All right, we're putting that one to the top of the list the next day till it gets done. And then we go through the next 5 till eventually you get down to the 1,000 things that need to be done. I think that what I certainly observed and what I learned were the people who were the most effective in this kind of process were those who had been through crisis before and had perspective. And I think that certainly now looking back at that time, it was an incredibly stressful time, having to go before reporters on a daily basis and explain, having to talk to stakeholders, people, again, with pent-up demand, wanting things to work instantaneously in this world where we can press our phones and have whatever we need sort of at a moment, within a moment. But you really have to keep your eye on the ball of fixing the problem and be very careful, I think, when speaking about overpromising. What I personally felt every time I went out and was speaking was to make sure what you're saying is right and true, and to really focus on keeping your own integrity. And there are, of course, times where you might, in a crisis, be given misinformation and what have you. But your own due diligence of making sure you're not overstating the case, not overpromising, and not getting distracted by, again, all of the pressing demands of people who want your instantaneous response.
Instantaneous response. Thank you, Chiquita. I'm only going to ask one question, and then we're going to have time for questions from the audience. Chiquita, when you talked about decision makers, you were talking about somebody who really knew how to manage and knew how to basically get the troops aligned, not necessarily the leader at the top. Now, Eric said he'd rather have a great leader than a great strategy. This is a business school, and here at McDonough we talk about principled leadership, and we try to focus on that. So let's talk about leadership for a minute. Now, when you look at Penn State, when you look at the University of Missouri, when you look at BP, when you look at Volkswagen, you see leaders who lose their heads. What does it take, and I'd like to go down the line starting here, what does it take to be a great leader in a crisis?
I think it really is key, and I agree with Eric's statement. You really need to have somebody who has the support and has the support of the team, that they know that that person is full of integrity and has the back of the organization, so that the team is doing their best work for that individual. You need, a strong leader does need to be decisive, but listening and really paying attention to what's going on, but then comfortable making a decision. Because just being a decision maker and someone who's forthright, if you're not listening to your advisors, to the people in the room, A, you'll miss the solution, and B, you won't rally people around. So they're not going, if they don't feel like they've been heard, even if they haven't been heard, they're not going to move forward in the implementation. And people can accept the decision much better, I think, if they know that their leader has listened but made a different decision.
Liz?
I'm not sure I have much to add to that. I tend to agree with most of it. I think what I find is that leaders need to have a cool head, need to not lead with emotion, but rather lead with an understanding of what is the strategy, what are our values as an institution, and what's the strategy. So staying true to that notion of doing the right thing. I think that being honest, forthright, having integrity, and doing the right thing, which may be defined differently, doing the right thing that's consistent with the organization's values is really important. Taking the long view and understanding this too shall pass, and it's only a moment in our larger journey as an institution. I agree on the taking input and being a decider. I think that those who are very internal and believe that they're the not just the decider, but they're the only person whose views matter is pretty dangerous. And then the follow-up to that is a strong leader in a crisis needs to not just be asking how do we weather this now, but what's the plan for fixing the underlying problem? because again, as both Eric and Shakita have talked about, that's the real key to minimizing the damage from the crisis, is not just cutting the head off the snake and moving on, but actually doing the hard work. It's easy to fire the CEO. It's much harder to really institute cultural and actionable change.
I think one of the first things I look for when I have a new client is, do they have the authority to act? Because if I am handed off to someone, I mean, one of the things I've become very sensitive to in my career is, am I being hired to be fired? One of the running jokes we have in the office is, you don't ever want to be the first crisis management firm. The first crisis management firm will be fired for botching it. But I think that a lot of times we are given a lead, a client that has no power in the organization to recall a product, things like that. The second thing I look for is emotional resonance. It's interesting. I think we talked about this, Bill, at your class last night. I don't think Bill Clinton would have had the email scandal go on as long as Hillary Clinton did. Bill Clinton is Clintonian. Hillary is Nixonian. And I think that, people simply wouldn't believe that Bill Clinton, they would believe that he's chasing women down the hallway. They wouldn't believe that he is misusing emails. And so one of the things we see is basic likability. I mean, why does Apple Computer get away with things that BP could never get away with? Well, if we like our Apple goodies, Apple Computer violates every basic law of crisis management to their benefit because people like it. That said, despite what I said about the authority to act and emotional resonance, in this particular climate, it's very hard for a chief executive to survive a head rolling contest. Nowadays, the general cry, like you see what happened at Mizzou a few days ago, if you are on the board of regents, you do not want to be spending day in and day out defending why you should keep the leader. So even if it is a wrong thing to do morally, what I am seeing happening increasingly is the leader gets bounced simply because the wound needs to get cauterized. So you could have great authority to act and tremendous management skills and emotional resonance, and still lose your job.
There's research that suggests that when the public sees a crisis, they think of the institution like they think of an individual. And so that may be why they equate the organization, the crisis, and the CEO. And that CEO basically epitomizes the crisis. So now let's open it up to the audience. Let's have some questions. This is going to be a great opportunity to have a great discussion.
My name is Ross Hollister. I'm from the School of Foreign Service. I have a question for Liz, actually. I was intrigued by what you said about determining a balance between fact-based and aspirational-based. Thank you.
Announcements. If you could perhaps go into a little more depth about how that calculus is made in terms of how much should be fact-based versus aspirational.
Yeah, I wish that I had a clear answer. I'm just gonna. I think when I got to VP, it was well after the spill. I got there in January of 2014, and the model. So my thinking on this has evolved because the model that and the communications philosophy that has been employed in the last 2 years, led by my boss, is, we can fight with facts. And the initial thought on that is, at one point, you do think, yes, that's true, but facts can only get you so far, particularly when the narrative is one of big oil company sullied pristine waters. That's a really hard narrative to change. It's an impossible narrative to change in my view, because we're fighting against huge institutional identities, right? An idea in America that it's big bad oil company versus the environment. So yes, facts are important. I think that they serve a purpose. I think that they resonate better with stakeholders, different stakeholders. And so I think that you really have to think of audience when you think of, are my arguments fact-based? So the media is not going to buy, again, going back to my idea, my background in media, the media, in most cases, isn't going to buy a study that BP puts out, even though BP scientists are looking at empirical evidence that show, for example, that the Gulf is actually back to pre-spill levels, because it comes from the oil company, right? So fact-based arguments are actually tougher with the media than they are with other stakeholders. The person on Capitol Hill who may be skeptical of us, but also may be looking at scientific data and maybe has a science background, might be more open to the fact-based argument of what we're finding. So it goes back to who's your audience, how are you trying, start with you, what's the objective, what's your audience, and then what's the argument, and I would tailor responses based on those criteria. I'm a big believer in facts. I think it's hard to argue with facts, but I think where those facts come from will determine just how effective that message will be. Again, I wish I had a better answer for you.
Over here, yes.
Hello, my name is May. I work at Shutdown in Indonesia before I go to Georgetown. So, related with the declining of oil price, before the declining of oil price happened, oil companies already assessed what's going to happen, whether if the oil price in a high, medium, or low price. But at the end of 2014, oil companies estimated the oil price will be around $80, but now it's just below 50. So how do you manage crisis that's even it's beyond in a war situation that you already explained? Thank you.
Yeah, a totally different crisis, right? And maybe to some, my family in Ohio would argue this isn't a crisis, right? Because oil's at $1.67 a barrel, or $1.67 a gallon out there. How do you manage that situation? I think you manage it the way you do any other crisis situation. It's commodity. We're in a commodity market. This is a great example of a crisis in which you have very little control. We have no control over what the oil price is going to be. Right? What we can control is our internal budgeting, our forecasting, the projects that we're going to produce. But the fact that there's a oil oversupply that has driven prices down globally is, I wouldn't argue for us it's a crisis. I would argue that it's a challenge. Right? Our playing field has shifted, and we need to figure out how to address that challenge. But I think in terms of a public response to that, there's not a whole heck of a lot that we can necessarily do to change the course. So how we adjust what we say about it depends on, you kind of have to focus on what you can control in that situation.
A question? Yes.
George Sabakis, DGen. It strikes me this is an incredible panel, and the insights are extremely valuable. My question to you all would be, how important are cross-sector partnerships on an ongoing basis to leadership to mitigate what eventually could end up as a crisis, et cetera? In other words, building trust, relationships through partnerships, so that when something does happen, because it's so difficult to demonstrate the ROI on partnerships. People will say, why should we partner, when there's no crisis or when we're not in that community? And you see that in politics a lot. Certain, parties or, candidates don't engage certain constituencies, and then it's like, oops, we didn't get the votes. So how can a corporate leader specifically look at this in a way, from a leadership standpoint, that cross-sector partnerships especially are important to mitigate potential crises?
Well, one of the things that I find is your allies retreat when a real crisis hits. That there's a very big, for example, I do a lot of pharmaceutical work. It is not unusual to have a doctor who is with you during peacetime, and then when things get ugly, they say, I'm not going to go on Good Morning America. One of the biggest problems I have in my business is someone who, a third party, who is willing to engage in combat. Because when things are good, it's easy to find those allies. But you have to keep in mind, I'm biased by the fact I get the most hideous cases imaginable. And so, the positive aspect of what you're saying is I do believe in managing corporate crises very much like a political campaign. You find friends. And one of the problems that we have, and I know my journalist friends don't particularly like to hear me say this, but I view mainstream media organizations as being not materially different from trial lawyers, short sellers, plaintiffs' lawyers, and left of center NGOs. To me, they're all the same. Yet it is, if the media have been accepting billions of dollars of in-kind services from these organizations for years, but if I hire a toxicologist for $5,000, that's sleazy. I think one of the things we're going to start to see is I don't believe the crisis management business belongs as an adjunct of the PR business. I believe that it belongs in some combination of management consulting and the reinvention of journalism. And a lot of what I am trying to do with my client base, with marginal success, is get them to invest in their own journalism. Because you're seeing this happen with the Republican debates. My view is if I were advising the Republicans, I'd be saying, why keep going on networks that savage you? Create your own networks and do that. So in terms of your issue about partnerships, I'm a big believer in finding and mobilizing allies. I'm also a believer that you have to be realistic, that when you get a hemorrhaging, awful dumpster fire crisis like what I get, these allies will often head for the hills.
Chiquita, the Obama administration and the Affordable Care Act had many allies. All kinds of public health people, many different cross-sector proponents. How did they act whenever the stuff hit the fan?
I thought your question was a very good one and certainly very relevant to the work of the Affordable Care Act. And yes, we had a lot of allies who were involved, and that was very key, particularly in the short term. Because as we were working to resolve the big picture issue of really getting the website operational, there were numerous things that were done in the interim to try to mitigate the issue. And so whether it was working with plans, the insurance world, to see what they would be able to do, whether it was working with people who were really on the ground, who were dealing with consumers. So going to a paper process, which had not been ideal, but was there for certain cases, really relying on a lot of the people who were on the ground to say, okay, we're going to help you fill out all the information, so as soon as the eligibility system is operational, we'll be able to get your information in. And really, I think partners can be key for helping you to figure some of those short-term strategies out.
Good morning. My name is Keith Williams of the National Turkey Federation. You've talked about turkey, as in the bird.
Turkey, yeah.
Not the country. You've talked a lot about perspective and expectations within the public, within the people that are managing crises. I wonder if there's something more basic that's at work here with what we end up with when we have crisis discussions. The public seems more now to be attuned as conceptual thinkers. About a generation ago, my parents, your colleagues, your parents, they were practical thinkers. And I'll use something from my junior high school years. We had shop class. We're working with wood, it splinters, or it's not quite the type. So you plane it a little bit. You work with it. Home economics, both young men and young women in home economics. A cake burns. Well, you learn how not to burn the cake, or you learn how to put a lot of frosting over it and cover it up. But you learn to deal with it. Now we don't seem to have that understanding that this is a very practical world, in some ways a broken world, always will be. And we're expecting perfection, or some of our younger people are, and some of the people that are in institutions where they own their conceptual thinkers. And I'd like to all comment on that and see if you see that as somewhat of a basic, because I was also a journalist, so I appreciated what I learned more in journalism was how to move from one thing to the next. The practical thing of dealing with a family that just got burned out of their apartment from a fire, and then going to a county commissioners meeting where they're arguing about the price of paper clips. But it was a good instructional thing, which went along with my university education. But I wonder about the practicality. So we lost that.
So what's underlying that question, if I grasp it, is we have a new generation today. They want perfection. They don't want any burnt cakes, no splinters. How do you deal in this modern environment?
And is that the basis of our society? A problem with our society that we need to get back to those things, some basics, and it goes to the education. Practicality, conceptual thinking is wonderful and is needed, but there's a lack of practicality or experience.
All right, I'm going to try to do this without offending anyone, but I'm going to apologize in advance because I might offend. So I covered politics for 15 years. Can you hear me if I hold it up? Yeah. I covered politics for 15 years. And here's what I know about, let's set aside generation for a minute. Let's just talk about the political framework, i.e. the social framework under which we operate in as crisis managers. And here's what you have in American politics and American society for at least the last 10 to 15 years. You have very vocal far right, very vocal far left, that are a sliver of the population, but wield immense power because they're so vocal. And what do they talk about? Ideals. The issue of climate change is a great example, right? You have those who say, leave it all on the ground. You have those on the other side who say, ignore it. It's not an issue. That's the far right and far left talking, but that's not where the country is. And yeah, there's a generational element here, but when you have the far right and the far left that are defining problems with in a perfect sense, right? Immigration is another great example. Send them all home. Round up 11, 12 million people and send them all home. Or welcome everybody with open arms, right? So we live in a country where the extremes have very strong vocal viewpoints. But these are not practical solutions. And those in the middle are struggling to map out on every political issue practical, pragmatic, reasonable solutions. So this is a society under which we're working. And as crisis people, understanding that we maneuver in a world of perfect solutions, but unreasonable solutions, having the strongest voice. That's a factor as we consider how to respond and how to operate. But modulating our response and understanding that's not where the majority of the people are and that's not how we do progress is important. So let's talk to generation. This is where I'm going to offend. This is the world that millennials grew up in. A world of extremes, a world of vocal extremes. And so why would we expect the younger generations, who are going to be the future generations, to have practicality underpinning their belief system when they grew up in a world where the extremes are vocal in defining the issues of the day?
I'm going to come at this from a totally different angle. I believe Hollywood has conquered reality. And, it's interesting. In Europe, there's an ethic of they've had so much war, they want to avoid conflict. In Asia, there's this notion life is suffering, you can't control it. In the U.S., we think we've got a guy. And there's the great scene in Ocean's 11, when actually Hollywood got it right, for one of the few times when George Clooney and his crew have knocked over Andy Garcia's casino, and Clooney ends up saying to Andy Garcia, look, I don't know, he lies. He said, I don't know who cleaned out your casino, but I think I can find out who did it. I know a guy who knows anything that goes on in the West Coast of the United States. And Andy Garcia looks at him and says, you know a guy. What I find is when you actually believe that Kerry Washington on Scandal ends the show going, it's handled. The truth of my business is almost nothing is handled. And drilling this down to practicality, all I can do is be very selective about the cases I take. I only take about 5% of the cases that come to me, because what stuns people is what they think they're going to say, they're going to get when they come to my office is, I am so good. Watch me work my magic. And what I say is, there's stuff out there about me on the internet that I worked with Enron. And the whole idea that I was some sort of mastermind. The truth of that story is, I was brought in and looked at the data, and I said, I have no idea what I can do for you in the communication sphere. This is going to be slugged out in court. And so, drilling this down to a practical level, when I have a client a potential client that I really believe I can do something with, and they are realistic, I will take it on. I do not take billionaires, and I do not take celebrities. Not only do they not pay, they have delusional expectations about what's going to happen. And I come back to, I think that this all began in my mind with the last LA earthquake, when I was watching TV, and you had a journalist go up to some city manager in LA after the earthquake and went, what went wrong here? The earth moved. But there's this idea that, hey, Ted in receiving screwed this whole thing up. But we have a guy in Washington who can fix this. So that's my cure, which is brutal practicality.
Okay, we're going to end. Yes, go ahead.
Make it quick. Dan Sparrow, professor of social innovation at Sustainability at George Mason University. Your CEO today had on, I think, coming off the front page of BP's website, a very facts-based argument related to global climate change. Yeah. Inspirational, and certainly builds on more than a decade worth of recognition by BP of this challenge, this crisis. It seems like a lot of the emphasis is on the upstream side. How can we increase energy efficiency and conservation, change the fuel mix, a lot of supply side things. Whereas, I think this forum provides an opportunity to think about social entrepreneurs and the role that they can be playing in the solution set, like solar co-ops, working with Habitat for Humanity on increasing efficiency upgrades of houses in low-income communities, things like that. Knowing that it's very hard for big institutions to operate on a dime, turn on a dime rather, how do you see some of the big organizations you've been working with, government, large corporation, and other organizations Eric's work with, working with social entrepreneurs that might be much more nimble in the small, medium enterprise zone to try to help work across society in social innovations? Thank you.
So I'm going to be very brief here.
Please do.
We were just talking about this in the earlier discussion. I think the key is when you have partnerships, whether they're big or small partnerships, that they always go back to the core business strategy and the core value system of the company, and aren't based on relationships or wanting to get something out of somebody, right? They have to be in service of a larger objective in your business strategy and your value system. And that's what I'd say, is that I think corporations have gotten away from this. Institutions generally have gotten away from this, and it can tend to be about who you know, and we're going to donate here, we're going to sponsor here. Our former CEO, Lord John Brown, just wrote a book in which he talks about this very issue, and I haven't read the book, can't tell you what the name of it is, but I've read excerpts in which he does say that this is the key, that big institutions have sort of lost their way because they haven't been true to their core strategy and their core value system in making these partnerships.
Okay, we're going to end this, I guess I'll dare say, with a touch of humor. So in Eric's book, he talks about the art of the apology. And he goes into different kinds of apologies. One of my favorites is, I'm really sorry if you're too stupid to understand what I just said. So I'm going to ask Chiquita, and I'm going to ask Liz this question, and then I want Eric to just give us a 30-second apology, a 30-second summary of the apology, the art of the apology. So did your organization apologize for the crisis, and what did you say? And then Liz, same thing with you.
Our organization, we had people who took responsibility and said, there were mistakes made and we are working to fix that, and defended the work of the organization.
Okay.
We did, and we continue to apologize and have made it kind of a core part, talking about this as a tragedy. And we continue. There was a direct apology. Again, I wasn't there back then, and we continue to do so. Actually, Eric probably has a better frame on precisely how far after we apologized, and I'm sure he has an opinion on that. But we're a British company. We've tried to do what's right, and throughout this, we've tried to do what's right, and part of that was understanding and acknowledging our mistakes throughout the process.
So Eric, give us a quick summary of the art of the apology.
Well, and the apology is just a price of entry. That's all. I mean, every time somebody apologizes, 100% of the time, watch the next time somebody apologizes, you watch the TV, watch the pundits. They will say that the apology was poorly executed. There's really a few types of apologies. The Judeo-Christian apology, which nobody wants to do because nobody wants to suffer. And that's really what an apology is. The transactional apology, which is what Kobe Bryant did. I would agree to apologize if we had some sort of misunderstanding. By the way, drop the charges and here's $4 million. That's a transaction. Then there's the marital apology, which is the one you use just to get out of the hostile encounter. And yeah, I did it. I'm sorry. Just leave me alone. But I think generally speaking, you have to go into it knowing the apology will be declared to have been poorly executed. And you also have to go into it understanding that if you listen to Mary Barra of GM, she didn't apologize for vehicles hurting and killing people. She apologized for letting down her consumers, because there's a legal problem with an apology in front of an audience is admissible in court. So the next time you watch an apology, you have to understand what the objectives are not Judeo-Christian. They are often tactical, legal, and communications.
And it's also beyond "I'm sorry," right? As Eric was saying, there's a whole bunch of different types of apologies, right? We talk very frankly about our regrets. We pleaded guilty and settled litigation. And so we talk about this, and yet the media always holds the standard. I know this, having been in the media, too. But did Hillary Clinton say "I'm sorry"? Right? It's "I'm sorry" is the standard by which the media believes it's an apology, and so you sort of have to think about. I would encourage everybody to think about that frame next time they watch and study a crisis.
Yeah, and in an apology, we want, the idea is the apology should end it. The media doesn't want the crisis to be over. They want it to continue, so they have to say that it was poorly executed.
And I'm sorry that our time is up. Let's hear it for this wonderful panel.